started working at Western Sydney Uni on the inherent requirements after our very good friend Trevor retired, and I took up the banner from the disability perspective, and then I moved on to RMIT a couple of years ago to start off developing inherent requirements, or an approach to inherent requirements, to the development of inherent requirements at RMIT.
And I think I've had on my PPR for about 7 years that it's my role to lead the development of inherent requirements at Deakin after Tony Payne was there. And, I've looked at it, I've been too busy, I've looked at it, I've gone around in circles, and I keep coming across questions around how I'm going to do this in a way that feels comfortable for me as a disability practitioner. Interestingly, this year, it came from the academic board. The academic board said, I think it's time we had a look at this, and pulled together a working group which has been representative of all the faculties, of myself, of someone from the governance unit that's been very interesting. We're still only just starting, and one of the things that's interesting is that in the first meeting, and in fact as we continue on, we're still questioning whether it's inherent requirements we need or something else. And it's been very interesting sort of discussion.
So how we got together is we started to talk about inherent requirements on the ADSET Community of Practice, Inherent Requirements Community of Practice, which Darlene and Jane very wonderfully hosted. I guess I'm coming from a perspective of being a supporter of inherent requirements if it's done in the right way. So I want to put that caveat in there.
And me, not so much. But
we actually found out we had a lot in common. When we started talking about it, we were going, yes, you're right, absolutely, that's exactly what I think. So I guess, that's the place, that's where we came to and sort of said, hey, we can do this together. We can talk about this together, because we're actually coming from the same place.
So just to sort of finish our little bit off by way of introduction, we're just going to let you know all the things we agree about. Yes. Because we really don't fight that much. We agree that students should have really good and accurate information available to them to make choices about their study.
And IRs are obviously one way to go about that.
And I guess I'm interested in exploring, particularly in terms of the new higher ed standards, and that's something we're looking at, as to whether there are ways we can bolster other things that might achieve the same end.
And one of the things that's come to my attention through the work that I've done at RMIT is the tension between, say, marketing and getting students in and bums on seats, and providing them with sufficient information to understand what they're getting themselves into when they start a program. And, certainly, some of the conversations that I've been having at RMIT with marketing, for example, are, oh, we don't want to tell them that. Oh, we don't want to tell them that. So I think there is a tension there between bringing people in, welcoming people, and actually giving them a really honest understanding of what's going to be required when they come in.
We agree that the best results come when students and faculty and disability services all work together. If there's any queries about aspects of a course or anything that someone isn't sure they're going to be able to complete.
And certainly IRs, I think, provide a vehicle for starting off those discussions.
Yeah. We agree that we must guard against discrimination or the potential for discrimination.
And, I guess one of the things that we both acknowledge in a really strong way, and I think everybody in the room would acknowledge, is that there is, the potential for misunderstanding. There's the potential for inherent requirement statements to be used in an exclusionary way. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly something that we're all committed to not happening.
Yes, and I guess the potential for the language to be used in a way that people will feel is discriminatory without understanding, and I know Trevor's here, without understanding the intent of inherent requirements and the application of reasonable adjustments to those inherent requirements.
Mm. And I think, one of the things that I've really come to in the work that I've been doing in RMIT is the education piece and how important that is, and how the implementation of this work needs to be very, very carefully considered, and that there does need to be an enormous amount of education. It only takes one conversation with one academic at orientation to turn off a student who might very well be able to finish a program. And, you know, oh, that won't fulfil the inherent requirements. So there's so much that needs to be put in terms of academics being able to understand what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about inherent requirements and how to talk about that in an inclusive way.
And I'll do the first bit of this sentence,
Yes.
you'll do the second.
Right.
We agree that any work in this area should not have as its aim risk management,
But rather should be about finding creative solutions, which, incidentally, I think disability advisors are excellent at.
and we agree that any work in this area should not be about exclusion.
But, of course, should be about inclusion.
There's our
So
little
we're going to hand over to these wonderful people who are going to talk about their experiences.
I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this wonderful land and their elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of everyone around inherent requirements. Many have been involved, all in good faith, and if I manage to sound like I believe otherwise, then just ignore me. You wouldn't be the first. These are my views in isolation, but no doubt do reflect many others, and my apologies if you're not acknowledged adequately. Oops, I've forgotten to switch the button. Hold on. There we go. I'm also undoubtedly, and apologies, going to talk too quickly and move through my slides too fast. So one inherent requirement for this talk is rapid visual and auditory processing speeds. Well, no. I'd argue it's simply something like a requirement to access and engage with the key information from the materials presented. So park that idea. The panic presentation to dodgy slides is just a bonus. I will be talking around the slides, so apologies for that. And this will be just the experience of our disability unit's involvement during the documenting of about the inherent requirements for about half of the courses at James Cook University, with a little bit of retrofitting of perspectives of others and insight. So I'll out myself and say I'm actually relatively in favour of the documenting of inherent requirements, for perhaps two main reasons. They simply provide more information about the course than the students get otherwise. It's available up front, which learning outcomes for individual subjects often aren't, and they don't provide the same type of information. IRs address the essential lines in the sand, without which the course isn't the course. And in doing so, they should make everything else up for negotiation, and that's good. The information provided can be a clearer hint of post-study realities for students than they get otherwise, especially early in their journey. And this helps with planning employment strategies, and we know employment rates are low and an issue for students with disability. The second reason is that if we pull out of trying to document inherent requirements, that void will not be neutral. It will be at least partially filled with unfettered assumptions, overestimation of requirements, and closet student screening, because it already is. So I can look at this from an occupational justice perspective. Now, occupation and occupational therapist view is basically includes all the meaningful things you do in your life, fundamental for health, well-being and quality of life. An occupational injustice is when structural mechanisms like the components of our education system deny people opportunities to engage and reap the benefits of these activities. This includes occupational marginalisation, occupational deprivation, where you are precluded, excluded, or have restricted autonomy or choice around participating in valued occupations, all due to factors external to you, such as the quality of the information available. Occupational justice is about empowered individuals, able to be self-managing and independent in informed decision-making, with full access to occupations of value. Medical models relying on experts for either translation or remediation of stated requirements are less so. So IRs are standalone documents, often read in isolation with unfiltered impact. What we choose to say and not say is important. So when our university got a sudden burst of inherent requirements enthusiasm in 2015 to have them ready for 2016, we waited for the call. The Western Sydney University model was chosen and approved domains of functioning were set. The inherent requirements statements themselves, the rationales for the statements, and examples were formulated by and were the property of small working groups of academics within each course and degree area. Teaching and learning areas drafted the surrounding shell and had advisory involvement. And still we waited. This is surprisingly consistent with our Queensland network peers at other universities where IRs have been written. But after 9 months, we saw final drafts and were told we were to write reasonable adjustments to go with the drafts for meetings in 4 days' time. So we had 1 or 2 concerns with this plan. Our first was that basically we agreed with Watt's guidelines and other universities' practices that inherent requirements need to be clearly separated from considerations about reasonable adjustments. Without qualifiers in them about the conditions for accessing, about choice, about tailorable adjustments, and about the possibility of only partial mitigation, example adjustments have a greater potential to be misleading than helpful. This can also lead the discussion prematurely to compensatory strategies instead of first understanding that fundamental match of the course for you. Our foremost concern, though, was that the documents were just not like any conversation we would ever have with the student. The alarm bells were about describing the student's characteristics too directly and making what felt like some major generalisations. So we rewrote the documents instead and presented them as just a way to understand what we would say. But they ended up becoming the basis for the final inherent requirement documents. They are far from perfect, or even possibly adequate, but they do highlight some concepts. Inherent requirements have only an implied definition in the Disability Discrimination Act and come from the UN Convention relating to employment. But they arguably relate to the work, not the person. And work doesn't have abilities, it has tasks. Work doesn't have knowledge, it has appropriate tasks performed correctly. Work doesn't have skills, it has tasks performed effectively and efficiently. And the attributes of work are the attributes of the work, not the worker. So writing inherent requirements for courses should start as an exercise in describing the task, not the person. Whoops. This is set up for a righty. I need some reasonable adjustment. What it's easy to do, however, is describe the person doing the task. Describe the way body components should work or which ones you'll use while you're doing something. It does cross over into discrimination if that characteristic is not actually necessary for the course. But the occupational justice impact is felt before that line. How do you feel if your performance review is about the kind of person you clearly are, assumptions about your motivations behind what you're doing, assessments of your core internal capabilities? Or would you rather just discuss the tasks of work? Usually how to jam more work in than will fit. We need to stop specifying what people should be. The most notable extensions of this practice happened last century and were generally regarded as appalling. So it's about describing what you do in a course, not about what you need to be or have. And our better attempts at this look something like this. Interact with auditory inputs sufficiently to manage learning environments and to meet patient care needs. Because learning from and responding to these inputs is required to provide safe and effective practice in nursing. That's a task, and a task that's pared down to its core characteristics, we hope. We don't care how you do it, but it needs to be addressed. But then we balked. like a deer in the headlights, and we blew it by sticking the ability to in front to match our framework that already said student demonstrates. Ability to is the person, interact is the task. And we went downhill from there. This is why the examples are often the go-to places in inherent requirement documents. In theory, they would be more likely to be specific tasks in the first place. And with our examples, we were a bit better at describing the tasks. And they were explained more. And we gave us specific activities that students can at least go away and Google. So an example is sustain a working posture and associated manual tasks, cognitive engagement, performance level and emotional regulation for the full duration of a healthcare practice, such as dissecting unborn large animal fetuses, hopefully only if you're a vet. And the task parameters need to be realistic, not idealised. We inherited a behavioural stability category in the brief, a pervasive term across a range of literature. Now, I get behaviourally unstable when I think about how much this sounds like behavioural constancy, which I don't see as a human category. So why make it a student one? If I've got a major distressing event at work, I'm going to be still professional, hopefully. But what I won't do is never change my emotions and behaviour. That's why I'm not a robot. Also because I'm too squishy. To just change the behavioural stability idea to a task, it might be maintain an existing and constructive behaviour pattern regardless of the circumstances around you. Not so bad. But it's still unrealistic and untrue. You won't actually get thrown out because you occasionally show some reasonable emotion on a course. The essential task might be maintain a range of responses in teaching and learning environments that are reasonably consistent applications of course materials, including material on self-care, hopefully, even in situations of elevated or challenging emotions. With this, hopefully you know you'll be taught the reasonable response range. You'll know you'll have issues if your responses are frequently or wildly dysregulated, and you do need to know this. Hopefully, though, you'll have clearer and attainable task goals to focus on for the strategies you'll develop to match whoever you are. And yes, it's longer, but so is saying students with a disability. We need clarity as concisely as possible, not just brevity. The next step is identifying or confirming which of those tasks are actually inherent requirements. This really does need the academics with the knowledge of the course, but I'd argue it also needs checks that you're actually still talking about fundamental tasks and a more independent eye on the assumptions about what's essential. What suggests that academics' perceptions, especially when encroaching on professional demands, may not equate with being essential. And consider including those non-essential elements that you would otherwise ditch as just additional tasks as well, if the fundamental purpose of these documents is just about providing clear information, and others have suggested that it actually should be. We also seem to be tying ourselves in knots trying to define what are essential tasks, without first defining what's the fundamental design purpose of each of the courses. Is it really designed solely to head to professional registration requirements? Or provide the practical skills for hands-on work in the field? Or provide knowledge in the field that can be used from a number of perspectives? Or just provide evidence of high-level learning experience? We don't usually articulate this at all, but it's the basis for everything and it should be transparent. So my conclusions for writing inherent requirement documents, or their distant cousins. Get plenty of people involved, including a course-stable group, as others have. If it takes a community to raise a child, then with this baby I think it needs a bunch of heads not to look like a prat on paper, as we possibly still have. Watch your early decisions. They're a slippery path. Get an explicit conceptualisation of the purpose of the course, specify date of writing and things may have changed since then. Clarify the timeframes for the students to meet the requirements, and if proportional progress along the way is a reasonable expectation. Let students know they will be assisted by the teaching itself and that's all students, but also by reasonable adjustments if they're indicated. Describe the major tasks of the course, not ever the person. Explain them as if to that emotionally unspecified robot, where you don't know how it's going to pick up the data or process it or generate the output. You're just telling it the inputs and the task. The point, not the practice. The what, not the way of the task. And give them enough concrete details across a range of settings, including ones that students wouldn't be privy to until second and third year. The performance parameters need to be realistic, and we need checks and balances to decide what's essential for the defined course. Perhaps listing things as additional tasks as well. And if you don't review them, you'll miss out on the chance to go, oh. Inherent requirements for courses don't have to be about screening for what you can't do. They can be about getting a clearer picture of the tasks you will accomplish and reinforce a sense of the possible and be a stimulus for creative thinking. Or at least, and there's no least about this, a tool for justice. It just depends on how we choose to frame them.
We have now 3 speakers from Griffith University, so I'll just introduce them individually. We have Sharon, who is a Disability Service Officer at Griffith for the last 14 years. She worked in a variety of disability services over the last 25 years and was once a wonderful RDLO for Queensland. Dinesh is a graduate, is that it? In a Doctor of Medicine and also has a Bachelor of Law. And we also have Lisa here, who is a Senior Lecturer in Clinical Skills and Assessment at the School of Medicine at Griffith and also a GP. So I'd like to welcome them all here. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone, my name is Dinesh. I had a motor vehicle accident in 2010 when I started the 3rd year of medical school, which caused a spinal cord injury at C6. So that basically means I don't have any function below the chest, but my fingers and half of my arms are affected as well. I had 5 years of rehabilitation after the accident and returned to medical school, and today I'm the first person in Queensland and the second in Australia and the first at Harvard Medical School as well to go through medical school with this type of condition and this level of disability. So I'm just going to hand it over to Sharon to go on to the next slide.
Okay, so when Dinesh returned, one of the things that interestingly happened in 2015 was that the medical deans of Australia also decided to do draft inherent requirements for studying medicine. It highlighted things more because of our work with the medical school and with Dinesh, and there was a lot of discussion at Griffith about the value of these requirements or the risks associated with applying these statements. Today I'm just going to talk you through really quickly some of the things we did as a disability team. Liz is going to talk you through the clinical and then Dinesh again, so we'll be clicking back and forth. So essentially we don't have inherent requirements at Griffith at the moment. We use the process of negotiating adjustments using the standards, looking at what is essential, how do we maintain academic integrity, and there was involvement, which Dinesh will talk to you about, with APRA. As far as, that's gone skew on your PowerPoint. Okay, the version that they can email to everyone will be okay. So as far as support from our team goes, we looked at a really client-centred approach. We looked at support from hospital and clinical staff, the medical school administration team, assessment staff within the medical school, our accessibility team, myself as the DSO for assistive technology, our assistive technology officer within INS, and our exams and timetabling team. And often there was collaboration between 2 or 3 of those areas to organise exams or organise OSCEs or different things like that.
Okay, so adjustments on campus. We looked at things like electronic course materials, PDF textbooks, Dragon Naturally Speaking for exams. So Dinesh was able to do his exams in our assistive technology labs using a Mac computer. We also had, because of the nature of medicine and the long hours, we needed to set up an alternative area that was open 24 hours essentially for his access. So an area was set up within the medical school where there were automatic doors that he could swipe through to go to a hot desk area with motorised height adjustable desks, a PC, and again another version of Dragon. And on the PC he used a RevoLab USB microphone instead. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Liz.
Hi, so my role is clinical skills and assessment. So I'm a senior lecturer at Griffith, and at the outset I'll say the adjustments we had to make were really minimal. And we actually went on the journey with Dinesh with questions and confidence in him, but without knowing the outcome. And I guess I've got something here that now GAMSAT, before you actually get into med school, say read inherent requirements before you even apply, and perhaps our example of courageously starting the journey is a really important example. So, one-on-one, we assessed where Dinesh was at and helped him prepare in our simulation lab before he went across the road. He was given an iPad by Gold Coast University Hospital so he could write up his clinical notes in the environment at the time. Dinesh chose to do not only the compulsory time in ED, but also an extra 7-week selective in ED, which most people would say is the area that's impossible for someone like Dinesh to work in. He proved them wrong. So from Dinesh's perspective, he can, of course, complete a history and is one of the best in our school at doing so. He can almost complete full clinical exams. His procedural skills that he has been able to accomplish include being able to put a drip in people. He can simulate neonatal intubation, and in fact all our fourth years had to do a paediatric basic life support, which we were ready to support him with reasonable adjustments, but he didn't require. And he has been able to do resuscitation with minimal assistance. What is important for Griffith is important for any graduating medical school. At no point have we compromised patient safety to help Dinesh's cause. I write the clinical exams, which are our objective structured clinical examinations, our OSCEs. And I would say two things. One, we've been enriched by the presence of having Dinesh, but for me, having to think about reasonable accommodations, it actually made me think about what are we testing. So I would actually say that every student at Griffith University School of Medicine benefited from my process of having to unpick what were the tasks we were testing and what is a reasonable accommodation. So I think Dinesh's presence honed my preparation for the assessment process. We had to create our own guidelines because our university guidelines to support students with disabilities actually weren't enough to compensate for the complexity of medical clinical tasks. So we actually chose, where other students had 8 minutes for their clinical exam and procedures, we gave Dinesh 12 minutes. So we lengthened that time, which allowed him, where required, to actually advise someone else how to do the skill. And so we sought national and international feedback on that process. And we also, I think importantly, brought in an independent QA process into our OSCE. And I guess I'd like to finish with some of the words. We brought the person who does the clinical examinations and assessment at the University of Queensland, and he actually wrote, obviously acknowledging that he thought it was a fair exam and that Dinesh was competent to graduate, and Dinesh will be graduating in 2 weeks' time. But he also added in his letter and feedback to have progressed to the end of a medical program in his unique circumstance demonstrates a great deal of resilience and dedication to his students and those to his studies, and those are both core qualities for successful medical practice. His communication skills were at a high level for a final year student, and he has developed techniques that allow him to perform satisfactory clinical exams. His knowledge demonstrated in the stations was at a level of a commencing intern. So I believe having that external audit trail is also crucial in how we have successfully helped our first student in a wheelchair graduate in a fortnight's time. Thank you.
So just a bit about APRA. We met with them and I had a chat to them before I came back to medical school. So they knew that I was going through medical school and they didn't have any concerns at that point in time. So there was full disclosure. They've been supportive and collaborative through the final 2 years of medical school. And in the past, they've registered doctors with similar impairments. So that there are medical practitioners with various impairments going through. So as we've said, now I've finished everything and my registration's in process with APRA. We don't really see many barriers there at the moment. My plan is to start work at the Gold Coast University Hospital in 2017. I've had some involvement with radiology, so I've done research, I've presented research that's changed practice of that area in our hospital. I've also been involved with some spinal cord injury research, which a part of it I was doing at Harvard, and we're kicking off a clinical trial next year with partnership of Harvard and a lot of other parties. So there'll be 10 patients involved and we're doing some really exciting things, which I'll be involved in next year. And I hope to go back there eventually to do some specialty training as well. So that's been my journey and what I'm going to be doing in the next couple of years.
So just a final comment. Our approach to inherent requirements at Griffith, the focus is, and as always should be, on responding to the individual students' requirements while maintaining the academic integrity of the program. Our contact details, I assume these will all be made available, but our contact details, and we're happy for the others to join us and take questions and go from there.
I didn't have to be mean at all with the timekeeping, so thank you, panel members. So we do have some time for questions. Have we got the, so we're just getting the roving mics, so if someone else is able to volunteer for one side of the room. So do we have any questions for any of our panel members? Up the back there, sorry, yep, thank you. Thanks, Michelle.
Just a question for Liz. Talking about the time for the clinical task, we've had some similar instances at Newcastle where we've tried to deal with the faculty around reasonable adjustment to clinical tasks, and we've hit lots of barriers in terms of the reality of extending that time and that being reasonable in the context of, is this reasonable in the hospital setting or in the patient setting?
Hi, thank you for your question. And I probably should have said, we did not adjust the time for the basic life support in year 3 or the paediatric life support in year 4. So we actually said that is a task. A patient is not going to die slower because Dinesh is in a wheelchair. So we actually made him actually do the task in the same time, even though he was instructing someone else in the basic life support task. We also made the person he was instructing do it wrong, so he had to correct her. So that was in the same 8-minute time frame that others. We decided that was a time critical task. Most tasks we do as doctors is not time critical. Dinesh had the same time as everyone else to take a history, but when it came to examination or procedure, we extended that. So we actually looked at each of the tasks and I guess looked at what the inherent requirement was behind the task.
Thank you. There's a question over there. Thank you.
Hi, actually, Liz, I have a question for you as well. It's also about the OSCEs.
I can't even see who.
I'm over here.
Oh, hello.
Hello,
Sorry.
Christine from Wollongong.
Hi.
We've also tried to extend the time in the OSCEs and have always been told it's a standardised assessment, it can't be changed. They have to do it as part of the circular process with all the other students. So I'm curious about the actual practicalities of the OSCE assessments with the extra time and how that worked in with what all the other students were doing, their OSCEs, or whether it was done separately.
So we had to run Dinesh's OSCE separately, but this Friday, so tomorrow, we're running an OSCE and we're actually allowing a student that's just had an operation on his hand and therefore had his hand in a cast to also have extra time. So it's not something special we've designed for Dinesh. I think it's something reasonable that we're accommodating for.
Hey, I'll put this one out to anyone on the panel that wants to jump up. With inherent requirements, particularly in your practical courses like health, what would your opinions be on those people that want to go into the courses solely for research and don't actually want to go into the clinical practice where those life-saving skills and the patient interaction aren't required? Would there be ways that we could allow students in purely research?
You want to take that question? I can. Yep. Thank you.
Have a go. Yeah, I think this is a conversation I often have in the work with academic staff and stuff. You know, we can't presume anybody's career trajectory or what they desire to do. One of the things that we've been tossing around at RMIT for a long time, I think, before the sort of inherent requirement stuff was the idea of graduating with a slightly different degree without having registration necessarily. Look, it's still an ongoing conversation. I don't know if it will ever happen. It would be terrific if if we could. I mean, we have students, for example, who might be studying teacher education and they are just continually struggling to get through their prac, and it goes on and on and on. They've finished all their theory, prac, keep failing prac. And, it just seems like perhaps there's another pathway there where they haven't lost what they've actually done, and that they can go out but perhaps not be a teacher, but still have their qualification recognised. So I think that's a bit of a watch this space. There's a bit of pushback from academic staff around that, I think. Trevor, I'm sure, has something to say about it.
I think Marion's now going to...
Sorry. I just want to clarify as well, when I was saying it's pretty important that we do outline what we think is the purpose of the course, and I wasn't meaning to imply that I think it's reasonable to say sometimes it's just to do, to meet one lot of registration requirements, for example. It may or may not be, I don't know. But at least if we put that down on paper somewhere, then people get to question it. They get to say, where is this thinking coming from? And they get to be part of that discussion instead of being hidden away. I think I'm agreeing about the idea about the different courses. There's a tendency around many places, including our university, to sort of shrink down the number of products being offered to students, as opposed to the times when students can exit at different points of long degrees with an alternative degree. And it's really important, I think, to have this discussion. If students can't engage with a course that they or that students with capabilities can't find a degree that actually fits their capabilities, then that's a related conversation to this one. Not necessarily exactly the same conversation, but still really, really important if the choices of degrees available are becoming too restrictive. But the first step is actually being upfront and saying what it is we think they're for, so then we can actually have that discussion out in the open.
Thanks, Marion. Trevor?
Yeah, we've encountered this sort of issue when I was at Western Sydney. Part of the main problem is that a lot of these courses are externally accredited, which will require practicums, clinical placements, and if you don't have those and you graduate someone in that course who hasn't met those requirements, then you risk the accreditation of the course and therefore the validity of the qualifications of those students and everybody else who's done the course. So in terms of those courses with external accreditation requiring practicums or placements that a student would have difficulty meeting, then they are inherent. You can't get around those. You can't replace them with something else. What you could do, and what we did do on a couple of occasions, where students, due to either acquired injuries or injuries that they came into the course with, or disabilities, that they were given the opportunity to transfer to another course that didn't have that practical component that they weren't able to meet. Had a nursing student went into a health science degree that didn't have the practicums. Another one went into social work, where it didn't require the same physical capability to, particularly gross motor skills. So I'm very, very sympathetic to the idea that people come into university for a very wide range of reasons and may not want to practice in a particular field, but if the course is designed to qualify a person to practice, then they have to meet those external accreditation requirements.
Thank you, Trevor. Any on this one? Oh, there's two more questions, and we'll and then have to leave it there because otherwise we'll miss out on morning tea. Thank you, Matt.
Hi, Annie from Adelaide. Dinesh, congratulations, and the team that assisted to get you through. I think you're a trailblazer. I would like to know if anyone on the panel knows of a student who has been accepted into medicine with an acquired condition who uses a wheelchair. I think there's been some situations where people have been 2 or 3 years into medicine and acquired an injury and then was allowed to continue, but I don't know if anyone in Australia has commenced. You do?
Newcastle. In Newcastle some years ago there was a paraplegic student. One of the questions I wanted to ask Dinesh, one of the issues we faced in Newcastle was the whole issue of sterility and the wheelchair. Once you scrub up, how did you deal with the whole issue of that sterility?
Yeah, so I did spend time in operating theatres. What we did was just clean the wheelchair as I went in. Because, you have beds rolling in there from outside and you have all sorts of things going in. So we just cleaned the wheelchair before I went in. And before I touch a patient as well, I wipe it myself with some sanitizer. So we found ways around it.
Fantastic. Matt? And then
I just want to applaud everyone on the panel today for the kind of depth of thought and the quality of thought that they're putting into inherent requirements. So I just want to say, thanks for that. There is to me, though, I think an enduring sort of question with this around who acts as the honest broker or who acts as the kind of independent arbiter of the inherent requirements process or the kind of transparency of academic requirements process. And anyone wants to sort of jump into that around what is the role of the disability practitioner, what is the role of the kind of specialist academic communities, and how do we ensure that there is a kind of sensible centre between what might be a legitimate kind of point of exclusion and who might sort of keep the whole process kind of honest.
Whoops.
So you didn't require an answer or anything, it was a statement? Beautiful. And sorry, the lady in red or up there, sorry.
My question was actually for Marion. I appreciate the task focus that you had with regards to developing inherent requirements. I just was wondering, however, whether that was better framed in a competency-based approach instead.
Okay, then we'll just have one more question and then we'll finish up. So.
Do you want me to just say I don't know? Who was that person? Wave at me so I can talk to someone. Hi. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I don't know is the answer. We just found it really easy to talk about tasks. It was nice and clear and straightforward. The level of performance of the task is slightly tangential, slightly overlapping issue. If you look at the Sharplin article on how they've worked out what the performance level, and then used when your performance level is too low, the threshold performance level becomes the inherent requirement for the teacher ed that they were looking at. So you can start having a think about performance levels of these tasks. I really like the idea of just breaking it down to as simple a step as you can get. First describe the tasks, because that makes it nice and straightforward. And even in doing that, you clear a lot of the extra concerns out of the way. And then sometimes the task is relatively self-evident. You're either doing it or you're not. But if it needs a performance component, then maybe consider it at that stage. And then it also made it easier to be looking at the inherent, as we are doing that process and breaking it down that way, lots of the concerns that I've heard in the inherent requirement discussions overall just didn't seem to be such an issue, because you'd already sorted it out. You'd already eliminated some of the grief that came in when all the different considerations are overlapping on top of each other when we've been writing inherent requirements on occasion. It makes it easy to pinpoint what you're trying to say, what's going on with the discussion, and how close to the mark you really are. So.
Thank you, Marion. Cheers. And just one last question and then we'll break for morning tea.
One of the speakers had mentioned that the term inherent requirements comes from the workplace, and that's inherently problematic. So I wondered if there was a different terminology that might be utilized, or if learning outcomes, I know that's something that accreditation standards often look to, if that could be substituted.
Marion's coming back up.
I shouldn't have said many things. I actually, I don't mind the concept of inherent requirements. There's stuff that we need to do when we need to do things. So, and I don't mind where it comes from. So having come from work place isn't particularly a problem. It's just it's a clearer way to look at it, because it's easy to find out, to think about inherent requirements in work, sometimes in courses. When we start talking about courses, you can see us all getting a bit confused about, hang on, but isn't the job to jam stuff in people's brains and do something to transform the person, so therefore I need to talk about the person, when maybe it's better to just go back to the idea of what are you actually trying to get the person to do, and what are the things they need to do. So in that sense, it's okay. But I do recognise the fact as well about there is a bit of a tension between the idea of just providing more information and then saying which ones are the lines in the sand, and how much we need to document those, and do they need to be documented totally separately from all other information there. Your learning outcomes component, we did find, like Uni of Sydney, I know says that there's come from learning outcomes. They're developed from there, and they've done a better job of writing about the task requirement, or using task requirement. Sorry, I'll get this sentence right. Using task language when they're writing what they're doing, but you can't necessarily assume all learning outcomes are written that way as tasks. You don't learn to do stuff. Sometimes it's learn to think in this lovely way. And most of the unis that I've seen, we've all got a bit of a mix of some task stuff and some other attributes.
Thank you, Marion. Anybody else wanted to respond to that question?
Can I also answer that quickly?
Quickly.
It also comes from section 3.1 of the Disability Standards for Education, talking about the process of determining reasonable adjustments, that's a key factor in that process. It may have originated in employment, but it's actually part of the legislation that we operate under.
Thank you, Trevor.
And look, my only quick comment was, and we're so not very far down the path, but what we're really looking for is not what we call them, but where they sit in terms of the information that's available to all students. And so this has been one of the interesting things, to look at the higher ed standards, the broad higher ed standards, not the education standards, and consider what all universities are required to do in terms of ensuring that students have got the information they need. So that's part of the path we're going on, is to think about, in our university, in the context of how we're addressing those things, where might this information sit? What we call it, I'm not sure, but I just have to say I was so delighted with these two presentations. Have given me so much ideas, and I want them all to fly to Geelong and talk to us all, our little working group. So yeah, it's been terrific.
That's wonderful. Just before we finish... Oh, yep, go for it. Sorry, Liz.
No. Just one thing in closing. I think what's made it so easy for us, so I just have to rebut what Dinesh said. He used the word just. I just cleaned my wheelchair. So I got up at 2:30 to come here today. Dinesh's mum got up at midnight, and Dinesh got up at midnight to be here. So he was never late for a surgical run, because he got up at 3 o'clock in the morning to be at work by 6:30 in the morning. So I think inherent requirements are inferring it's all, we need to make adjustments, we need to fix it. Dinesh has done so much, I've done so little in comparison.
Thank you very much.